Hey guys, so I'll show you how to create an Ansible setup using VMware. So I have a VMware workstation, I believe it's version 15. You have to make sure that it's installed. Go to Files, click on New Virtual Machine, create a custom advanced type and just select Next. Make sure that you choose your ISO image. So I'm going to be using a CentOS 8.2 ISO image. You could also go ahead with a Fedora 30, 31 or 32. It's all the same, right? I'm going to use CentOS for this demonstration. And here itself, you can create a user account for your machine. I'll just let the username be same. Set up a very small password. And I'll just name the virtual machine in a way that I can understand what the purpose is later on. If you want to change the location where your VMs are going to be stored, you could change that here. It's just a demonstration for me, and I'm going to be deleting this off later on, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. For your setup, one processor with one core is more than enough. For this demonstration, I just want to speed things up a bit. I'm just increasing the processor count to 4, right? And again, a 1 gig or a 2 gig RAM for your control node is sufficient for all the demo exercises that you will be working on. But for me, just so that that setup goes in a very fast manner, I'm increasing it to 16 gigs. I'm going to bridge the network, although NAT is also fine. The idea here is to have an internet access to your virtual machine. That's fine. No changes here. I do have an NVMe disk in my laptop, so I can change it to that. In your systems, you probably have a SATA disk or an SSD, but you can go ahead with SATA option there. I'm just changing mine here. And I would need to create a new virtual disk for this VM. 20 gigs is more than sufficient because again, this is just a demonstration thing, and all the exercises that we are going to be working on would not require more than this space because you're just going to be creating a lot of playbooks. It's just small KBs and MBs of size, right? Not more than that. So 20 gigs is more than enough, so let it be. And I don't want to store this disk as multiple files. I'll just store it as a single file. It's more portable in that manner. So if I want to carry this VM to some other machine, it's a lot easier to have it like that. And I would not select this option where you can allocate all that disk space now, which basically means that this is dynamic in nature. Only when you end up using all the space, it will take that space from your base machine, right? So if you are currently using only 8 gigs inside the virtual machine, that is a space that will be used in your physical machine as well. So it's a good idea to just leave it unchecked as it is. Click on next. And that seems to be okay. We have made all the settings that we need. So probably I can just click on finish. And that should take me through the installation process. So give it a moment for the VM to boot up. So I believe there's a few settings that we might need to change here as well. So that's the reason I'm waiting. Alright, so because it's a VMware advanced installation, it just automatically took it up. So my root account's password is set, and that user that we gave in the initial stages, that Nivedi along with the password, that would be created in the setup. So don't go about what's mentioned here. Your user is being created, so nothing to worry about there. And the password that you set for that user there would be the same password that is set for the root account as well, right? So the VM installation might take a few minutes for me. So I would probably pause the recording here. I'm not even sure if that option is available in the session I'm using, but if it's there, I'm going to pause it now and probably I'll resume it once that installation is complete. All right, so the installation seems to be complete. My VM is now booting up. Now, before I do any other settings, what I would prefer you guys to do is power off this VM and then take a clone of it, right? Instead of installing all those nodes, it's a lot easier to just clone the VM, right? So before I clone that, since my installation is already complete, I will just make sure that I push my RAM back to 2 gigs and my processor count may be just 1. Now 2 gigs is only for the control node. For all the managed nodes, I would only require 500 MB of RAM or maybe 1 gig depending on whatever you have. It's really fine. So we do have a clone option. So I'm going to make sure it's a fully cloned one just for this one instance of a managed node. The rest of them can be linked. But yeah, for this one, I'll probably make a fully cloned one. And we'll just rename it to say node 1. Everything looks good. Give it some time. Let the cloning get over. Then we'll continue. Right. Fairly fast. So I have my node 1 and again I'm just going to edit my virtual machine settings, ensure that the RAM is just 1 gigs. Rest everything seems to be okay and we'll just clone it again. So you could use a linked clone. It basically just means that it's going to share some of those resources from the previous machine. So depending on what type of resources you've allocated, you can make a decision for yourself whether you want a linked clone or you want a fully cloned one. So I'll create a fully cloned one here. I'm going to delete these off once this video is made anyways. Again, we'll give it some time. Great. So it seems like right now I have one control node and I have 2 of my managed nodes. If you want to add more nodes, the steps are pretty much the same. Just clone it, rename it, and for a demonstration purpose, I'm just going to use 2 nodes, but for a, a testing node, if you're trying to work out a solution for your infrastructure, I would recommend that you have at least 4 of these nodes so that you can get an idea about how to group these hosts and make those decisions yourself, right? But for my demonstration, I'm just using 1 control node and 2 managed nodes. Being said, start my virtual machines. Let's start with the control node and we'll do the setup one by one. Give it a moment for the virtual machine to boot up. I'm going to log in using the password that we gave initially. Right. So I'll just close off those initial boxes that you get by using CentOS. So I need to check a few things before I go ahead. So I would like to make sure that I do have network access. So ping is going through, which means we have network. And I will just make sure that I am logged in as the root user from my terminal. Password was the same that we set up earlier. So now I'm logged in as the root user. So I need to make a few changes on my control node. One is that first, I don't like that host name, localhost, so I'll just change that. That would be the first thing that I do. So probably a host name ctl set host name control.example.com or something like that. Great. So now we have our host name set up. Second, we have an internet access to our virtual machine, which is awesome. But then I don't want my IPs to keep on changing each time I power off my machine and start them back again, right? So what I'll do is I'll just make sure that we have a static IP in our system. So to do those configurations, I would require some information like what is my gateway? You can see my gateway, something like this, and interface that we're using is ENS33. You have that information about your IP address and also the gateway in front of you. So you could just use your NMCLI commands to create a new connection. So maybe a connection add with some name. And what is the type? An Ethernet type inside the virtual machine. We want to make sure that this profile, that is a test profile that you've created, should automatically connect every time your system boots up. And face that we're using is your ENS33 IP address. I'm not changing the IP. Yeah, probably we won't change the IP. Let it be as it is. Subnet is 24. Gateway is given. That should be okay. Right, so DNS is also important. Sure, so we will just do a connection modify on that test network. Ensure that our DNS is configured. And that should do it for us. So just make sure you have your profile here. I will probably delete, yeah, so connection, delete the old one that was there, and I will make sure the connection that we have created will become activated. This time you have your network access. At the same time, you have a static IP in place. So that will give you some more control over your Ansible configuration. That was the first thing. Your network is set up, your hostname, etc. So at least your networking part of it is done. The second thing to know here is that we are using CentOS machine, which by default will not have the Ansible package, right? So that would require you to add up another repository. And that repository is part of this official repo. So all you need to do is install a package which is called Apple Release. So Apple basically stands for Extra Packages for Enterprise Linux. And this is where your Ansible is located. So just make sure that you have this package installed. And for me, I would generally prefer having a bit more control over my machines. So I would install vim bash completion git 3. I think that should be it for now. Later on, if I need something, I'll add it at that. Give it a moment for testing. It already had, no, it did not. So it is installing the Apple release. We'll give it a moment. All right. So with our new repository in place, you could just go ahead and install Ansible. It has a bunch of Python dependencies that come along with it. So if you're installing the latest version of Ansible, which is 2.9.10, that is good. My network seems to be freakishly slow today. Please be patient with me. So by that time, maybe we could just talk about what would be the next step. So once that Ansible package is installed, the only thing that I can think of as of now is my nodes is where I will have to create a user, and Ansible will require a passwordless SSH connection to those nodes. So I still have one command left on the control node, which is to create an SSH key pair. So you could do it as the root user, or probably if you're working with Ansible, you will require a non-privileged user. So maybe we'll do that as the normal user itself. And with CentOS 8, I believe the firewall is taken care of. It should be installed, and the SSH service should be already activated, but we will check that as well. So maybe this time we could use that time to just open up another terminal and create an SSH key pair. An SSH keygen command do that for you. Alright, so we'll wait for this to get over, then I'll power on the other nodes and do the configurations there as well. So all the setup that I am doing right now is also automated. I do have two scripts kept inside GitHub, one for the control node and the other one is for managed nodes. So you could pull up, do a git clone from that repository and run those scripts, and all this setup will be automated for you as well. So I would put the link to those scripts in the description as well. Maybe that would make your life a bit more easier. But if you ask me, I would prefer that you go through this manually once so that you get a hold of or a better understanding of what needs to be done, and maybe later on, once you're comfortable with Ansible, you could just automate those things instead of wasting your time passing those comments again and again. But for the first few times, it's always good to know what you're doing. It's a good habit to know what commands are there, what it is performing, getting an understanding of what's happening in the backend. Great. So that seems to be done. So we have our Ansible installed, and the latest version of Ansible has around 3,300 modules. It's a lot. All right. So now we'll go into our nodes, and I'll start my nodes as well. Logging in to both the machines. So on the nodes, right? So what do we need to do on the nodes? Well, it's pretty much the same steps. First is that I do not like that host name, so we would change that host name first. So set up the host name as, say, maybe node1.example.com. Because this is my node. Copy this over to your second machine as well, so that we can do the same tasks in parallel. So this would be my node2.example.com. And the next thing that we need to do is ensure you have network access. Okay, so we have network access on node 1 machine. Pretty confident that that's the same for the machine 2 because they're cloned. Next, we will check our gateway and also the interface that is attached to this machine. So this is 31, and for node 2 I'll do the same steps again. This is 31 and 32 is the one for node 2. Great. So again, we will make sure that we have a static connection set up in place. So NCLI connection add connection name, give it some name, and the type is Ethernet. Interface name is ENS33. What else? What else? So definitely we need to make sure to automatically connect to this particular profile. And finally, the IPv4 address along with the subnet and the gateway as well. Interface, type, auto connect, and the name. So everything looks good. Can modify, test, DNS. Let that be 8.8.8.8. We should be good. I'll just copy this command to my Node 2 machine. And the only thing that I need to change here is the IP from 31 to 32. And same goes for DNS settings. Right. Now ensure that you have deleted the previous configuration and you're using, oops, look at that. I just deleted what we created. Alright, so that doesn't matter. We have the commands right here. So I could just pass them again, right? There we go. So we have our network setup done on our node 1 machine. My node 2 seems to have the network configuration done, but it seems like I must have forgotten to change the host name. So we'll do that right now. The hostname ctl set hostname node2.example.com. Great. So everything seems to be fine. Just to remind myself the IPs. Now what I would do here is, before making any other change, we will go to our control node once again, log in, and just ensure that these hosts are resolvable from the control node, right? So you just make an entry here for both node 1 and node 2. So most of the time you would be working from your control node and you'll be working on your nodes, your managed nodes, which is the reason why I'm making sure that these nodes are resolved on the control node. But if you intend to use your nodes to do a manual SSH back to these machines, so it's a good idea to do this inside the nodes as well. So you can make sure that node 1 has that IP address of control node and the node 2 inside the etc hosts file for this machine, right? You could do that, but since we are working with Ansible, I don't think that is required at all. So you could just leave it like that. Verify that you're able to ping these machines. Everything looks good. I just want to ensure one more thing, right? If I am able to connect to these machines. So as you can see, you're able to do an SSH from the control node into the node 1. You could do the same verification for node 2 as well. There you go. You're able to do an SSH with both the machines. One thing that I wanted to change here is I want to make sure that I don't have to give this password again and again, because I'm going to be working with Ansible and it's something that I won't like to do again and again, right? So we would configure a passwordless SSH access on these machines. So maybe the simplest approach would be do a SSH copy ID on these machines. So what I'm doing here, I'm running a for loop on node 1 and node 2, ensuring that the command sh copy ID will be running on both these machines. And once those keys are copied, then I would have a passwordless SSH access from the Naved user to the Naved user inside my nodes. You'll have to give a password for both the nodes here, and this is the last time that you would be needing to do that. And you could verify by doing an SSH again, and this time you're logged in without a password. Check for node 2 as well. Everything looks good. Last few changes that we'll be doing on the nodes is that you go to the node. Now you have those passwordless configurations set up for yourself, but you also want to ensure that this user is able to do a sudo without providing a password. First, you have to check whether this user is actually part of the sudoers group, right? So if you do an ID command, you can see that this user is only part of his own primary group. There is no secondary group associated with this user. So this user actually cannot pass sudo commands as of now. That has to change, right? Because with Ansible, you might be doing some package installation, some restart of services, some firewall configurations, all of which would require a root privileges. And therefore you would connect to the Naved user on the node and then escalate your privileges to the root account. So just to ensure that those things are set up as well, I'm going to log in again as root on both of my nodes, so node 1 and node 2, and we will just ensure, well, for one, we have to make sure that your user Naved is a member of the wheel group. The wheel is the group that gives the user sudo privileges, at least in Linux systems. In CentOS or Red Hat family based systems, this is the name of the group. Ensure that user is part of that group, and also make sure that he has a passwordless sudo access. So go to your vsudo configuration and make a change here. Just comment the line that allows all the users to pass all the commands, and just uncomment the line which does pretty much the same work but without a password, right? So you could do that for both of these nodes. I'm going to make the same changes on my node 2 as well. So first, let's just check that he's not part of the wheel group, which is true because it's a cloned VM, so obviously it's not. Make sure that he is appended to that wheel group, and finally ensure that he would have a passwordless access to everything that the root can do. How do we verify this? It's quite simple. As the normal user, you cannot access the root's home directory, you get a permission denied, but with a sudo you can. And this time, that happened. Interesting. So where did we go wrong? Give me a moment to check into this. Seems to be all fine. Oops. Everything looks okay. For some reason it asked for a sudo password, which should not have been the case. Let me just verify for node 1 as well. Not sure why that is, So it is mentioning that Nived is not part of the sudo's file, but we have added the user into the wheel group. Probably it's not something to do with us, probably something else. It is a new bash process, so let's run the magic command of Linux. Just reboot and everything magically starts working. Just give it a moment for the machines to boot up. I'm quite confident that we have done everything correctly. It doesn't seem to be a problem from our side. It might be a small bug which should be fixed by a reboot. Right. So fingers crossed this time. Again, passing the sudo command. So it went through without any errors. So like I mentioned, it's just a bug, and the magic command of Linux, that is reboot, solves all the problems. So we will still verify the same for node 2 as well. So my nodes seems that we have set up our nodes correctly. Our nodes are reachable from the control node. So let's go ahead and make our first project. We'll create a very small Ansible configuration file just to make sure that Ansible is able to reach these nodes. Remote user is Nived V. We'll have to define an inventory file, call it hosts. We will use sudo for this. That's what we have configured. And we have a passwordless sudo configurations. Everything looks okay. So we will define our nodes as maybe test machines, node 1 and node 2. Just a quick Ansible test on these nodes using the ping module. So you can see that Ansible is able to connect to those machines, and also just to verify that it is using privilege escalation, you may pass an ID command. It should return back saying that it connected on the node 1 with the root account. So that's how you configure Ansible, all the nodes. If you want to ease up your life a bit more, what you could do is just install one node, make sure that you have configured all the things that we have done, and then later on make those clones, right? The only thing that you'll be left with later on is to make sure that IP is statically configured and also the new IP address is mapped to the control node. That could just maybe save another 5 to 10 minutes of your time. That being said, that's all for this demonstration. Happy learning.